going to go ahead and get started. I think we're just a little bit ahead of time, thankfully for those buffers. So everyone should see myself, Peggy, and Tim spotlighted on their screen, as well as a shared slide right now. So coming into today, we really wanted to set the stage for what it's looking like statewide around broadband. So we've invited Peggy and Tim both to speak in their respective roles. Peggy as the Executive Director of the ConnectMaine Authority, who should be no stranger to anyone on this call, and Tim Schneider, who's the Chair of the Maine Connectivity Authority Board. As we know, over the last year, there have been some changes at the state with the creation of the Connectivity Authority. And so it just is really exciting to have both you, Peggy, and Tim talking together about what it's looking like statewide, the growth of the ConnectMaine Authority over the last couple of years, and the creation and future of the new Maine Connectivity Authority. So we're going to kick it off with Peggy. Each speaker is going to have about 10 minutes, and then we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. I do encourage you to throw your questions in the chat. There isn't enough time for everyone to ask a question, but we are going to pull all of those questions and get those up on the Maine Broadband Coalition website with answers after the summit is over. So please feel free to add them in. And in those last 10 minutes, we'll pull a couple for both Peggy and Tim to talk through. So with that, and if that wasn't a very important phone call that Peggy needed to take, we're going to get started with Peggy Schaffer. Welcome.
I actually think Tim is going to kick off. Did I?
Nope, it's you.
Okay.
Tim's like, no, thank you.
It's not what we agreed to yesterday morning, Tim. So, you know, ConnectMaine has had, as you all know, a number of challenges over the past several years, mostly related to the amount of funding that we have not had. And this new, and yet we have, I think, gone ahead on a pretty aggressive strategy. Some of it is about that we sort of knew this federal money was coming, so we wanted to make sure that we had pieces in place to make it go. And, you know, in the past, we've distributed, over the last 10 years, we've distributed probably $12 million in funding total. And in the last year, including this next round, we'll have distributed $22 million. So it's like twice what we distributed for the first 10 years. So that's put, you know, a lot of strain, not only on us, but on communities. And I think one of the things that we've worked at really hard in this past year or so is to try to figure out how to better support communities. And that comes from the philosophy that really communities are where this all starts and where this whole planning takes place. And so the work that we've done to try to work with the Maine Broadband Coalition to put geo partners in place, to try experiments like the Maine West program, to work with the Maine Community Foundation on their broadband grants, to change our community planning grants every round. We do change them every round. Is all part of how we are learning to better support communities as we go forward. And I think the geo platform, the work that we're doing with Vetro and the Vetro Cares project are all sort of part and parcel of how we move that forward. And I think the fear that I have is now that supposedly all this federal money is going to rain down on us, that everybody takes a deep breath and takes a step back. And that is absolutely the wrong thing to do. You know, we have been building, if you want to use sort of a campfire piece, right? I was a Girl Scout for many years. We've been building this campfire for a long, long time, right? We've put the tinder in place, we've put the kindling in place, we've put the logs in place. Those are all pieces that have to be in place. This new federal funding is in fact the match that's going to make all that stuff go. But if all we've done is create a pile of leaves, that match is just going to burn itself out and we're not going to have anything from it. So it's just really important that we continue this community planning activity that we've been really heavily engaged in. We know there are real problems with the data, and we are working to improve that. It's going to take some time, and it's going to take everybody's help to make sure that we have the right data, so that when this new federal money comes in, we can target it appropriately and correctly. But that all takes these community conversations. And I think what we have learned just recently with the elections that happened in November is there is a significant role, an important role for these community conversations to be able to help communities move forward, right? So we saw Hamden, which really, it's like a town council. They had started a planning process a while ago and it kind of petered out. They got a new town manager and a new economic development director who was very interested in it. They moved forward with a planning grant and moved forward with a proposal that they brought to the town. And when they brought that to the town, there was a campaign against it that got mounted by a number of outside forces. And they didn't really have the pieces in place to make sure that that passed. And so it unfortunately failed at the ballot box. And just last week, the exact opposite thing happened in Leeds, right? So they also had a proposal before a special town meeting. The same group came out and opposed it, but this time the outcome was different. And that is because of the depth of the conversation in that community. And so I really can't emphasize enough the importance of not only gathering the data and getting your information, but also talking with your neighbors. And the challenge that we have in Maine, that is that towns have a propensity not to work together. And tomorrow I'm going to have Christina Halquist and Carol Monroe. Christine is the director of the Vermont Community Broadband Authority, which is the new authority that Vermont created this year to implement their strategy, which is community union districts, I believe they call it, CUDs. And Carol Monroe is with ValleyNet. And I think there's a really valuable lesson to be learned in that. So first off, Vermont picked a path, which is, we have not done that in Maine, but they picked a path in Vermont and are moving forward with that. And that has helped them really focus their energies on how to support that path. But just as importantly, the basic structure of how you move a thing like this forward, the feasibility studies, the business case, all of that work that communities need to do did not go away just because they have a structure, right? So those to me are the important pieces that we must continue as we look at this federal funding. The new funding is going to flow through the Maine Connectivity Authority. But we are working very closely with them. I mean, there's only 3 of us, right? So how closely can we not work? And we want to make sure that this is a seamless transition for everyone, so that all of you who are out there working on this, don't stop what you're doing. Keep going. Keep doing it right. And the structure and the processes to help you realize that broadband in your community through this huge influx of federal funds is going to continue to be there, because in behind the scenes, the ConnectMaine Authority and the Maine Connectivity Authority are really committed to a shared principle of making sure there is not a disruption in this process, and that the values that we have all hold dearly about the importance of community voices continue as we march down the road with this new federal funding. So that's my quick overview. I don't know, Tim, you want to jump in and talk about sort of what happens once we get this all built?
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks for that overview. So first, I guess I'll continue in the theme of thanks. I'm really grateful for Peggy for her leadership of ConnectMaine over the past few years. Really, I hope that she glossed over a lot of hard work there in building community, distributing funds, and really providing the platform that the Connectivity Authority is going to use to deploy the unprecedented amount of state and federal funding we have now for our broadband. So first, just hopefully we take some time over the course of this to appreciate Peggy and her leadership. And then I guess also thank you for this opportunity to speak from the coalition. It is, it fills me with so much joy to see so many people committed to the cause of broadband in Maine here in attendance. And I just appreciate all the hard work behind the scenes that has gone into both carrying off this conference and the ongoing support and networks of influence and support that people are giving to each other as we try and expand broadband access in Maine. It is just the coolest thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Connectivity Authority, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some hopes and dreams for once that work is successful, as Peggy alluded to. So first, the Connectivity Authority. We are still, and we are no longer an all-volunteer organization. We have brought on our first staff. Andrew Butcher, who's should be familiar to all, has begun work on behalf of the authority and is expected to be nominated as the president of the authority once the legislature returns to session. And our primary task is our sort of broad statutory goals will be familiar to folks who've been following the cause of broadband in Maine, right? We're aiming for universal broadband access to every home and business in the state of Maine. And we, for the first time, have the ability to do this, I think, the ability to deploy funds that are commensurate to the problem that we have in the state. So just sort of ballpark funding. We have $21 million in American Rescue Plan funds that the state has pledged, 10 million this year, 11 million next fiscal year. We have an additional 128 million that's going to be administered by the Treasury Department under the Capital Projects Fund, and then a minimum of 100 million from the Invest Act that was just enacted, but probably much more than that, as the formulas that are used to allocate funds under that are worked out. And there are also competitive grant programs and additional funding for digital equity that will come through the state. That's a lot of money. And I think that if we are successful, the broadband, we as in the state and the Connectivity Authority are successful, the broadband landscape in Maine will look very, very different when the Connectivity Authority's work is done. In terms of the Connectivity Authority, our task is to have a plan to spend these funds, to clearly communicate that to communities, to advocates and providers, so they understand how to access those funds and how to integrate with those plans. And I know that you will all hear more from us in the coming weeks and months as Andrew gets up to speed and we are able to begin that work. And you know, the challenge of communicating it will be just as important as the challenge of deploying, I think, so that we can take these dense networks of advocates and providers and potential funders and knit them together to a common purpose. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm going to spend the limited time I have remaining to pose a different challenge, I think, to this broader community. We know how to do much of the core work of bringing broadband to un- and underserved areas. This is a deployment problem. Much of that has been solved. We have good models in Maine for how to do it. And like the work of putting fiber on poles or antennas in the air, like that's a technical problem that we know how to solve. I think there's good models for almost all of that. And the work of the Connectivity Authority will be to implement those models. I don't think we have a clearest picture of what to do once we get there. And what do we do if we are successful in bringing high-speed connectivity to every Maine home and business? How does Maine look different when we get there? And I don't mean that we don't know how to use the technology, like it's not just a simple digital literacy question, like, although that is clearly will be part of the Connectivity Authority's work. I guess what I mean is that we believe these technologies have the potential to transform communities. Like they have the potential to alter their future. And I wonder if we have a fully formed vision of how that future could be different. I think there's sort of two general paths. The first is like, there's a lot of things that make living and starting a business and raising a family, all this work in rural Maine challenging, right? And like, there's lots of things. We used to think, when I remember working with the Island Institute, there are many challenges to running a business on an island, and broadband is one of them. And if we are successful in bringing broadband to a Maine island, we can just take broadband off the list, but there will still be a list of other things. And maybe that's good enough. Like maybe of the challenges that rural Maine communities face, the access to broadband would just be off the list of things, and we just get working on the next set of things. It'd be like rural, but now with more Zoom or something like better Netflix. I don't know. But I think there's potential for something more. And to date, in our limited experience, I think this technology, this potential in Maine is largely untapped. I think that we have the potential to use these technologies to address those other things, right? How will we use technology to address the challenges of rural Maine seniors, to address healthcare, to address education challenges in those communities? And I think that's largely under-theorized because all of the broadband deployment we've seen to date, these next generation networks has happened in urban spaces which have different challenges and where the technology is utilized differently. I think of this because I'm like a infrastructure nerd in like the most boring way. And I spent a lot of time thinking and reading about the early histories of transformative technologies for rural America. And two of those technologies that I think provide examples for us are radio and electricity. Both of these are technologies that were touted in their days as having the potential to transform rural life. And both of them were successful in their way, but sort of in different ways. So let's just talk about radio. So hilariously, the early innovators in radio were land-grant colleges. They were really deliberate about putting their radio to work to solve the problems of rural communities. One of the first broadcast licenses in America was issued to WHA in Wisconsin. And they used it they sort of initially deliberately set to work to solve rural problems. And it turns out like the killer apps of early radio were things we wouldn't recognize today. Detailed weather reports for the first time, like predictable, reliable weather from meteorologists based at these universities. Commodity prices, right? Being able to tell a farmer what price they should expect for their goods when someone came around to buy it or when they put it on a rail car. And to some extent, remote learning and education, right? Like the universities were delivering lectures over radio, complete with course materials that they would mail to participants. That early history of radio, like early AM radio history, early 20s and 30s, was mostly, was relatively short-lived because pretty shortly we shifted to a pattern of broadcast that was rooted in cities, that was commercial, that centralized transmitters in urban centers. And so the programming that rural residents got after that was, I think, similar to what we see on the internet now. It's mostly generated in urban centers and broadcast out to the cities, right? This is the Netflix model of programming. There's a whole bunch of history there about how that transition happened, but that early vision of like how radio might be put to use to solve the problems of rural communities was largely unrealized as we shifted to a centralized broadcast model in urban centers. On the other hand, with electricity, rural electrification was, again, had the same potential to transform rural life. And there was a deliberate effort by rural electric co-ops, who are the funding recipient for the Rural Electrification Administration's funding, to think deliberately about how to sell electricity to farmers, right? To sell appliances along with the services, things that were legitimately transformative, providing light, washing, electric water pumps, heat. And the co-ops sat in those communities and stayed put and made sure that those benefits were realized. And what's fascinating now is that those same electric co-ops across the country are now putting that same energy to work on broadband, right? Making sure that those same communities have broadband deployment. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think that we can take this transformation of broadband for granted. If we're not deliberate about thinking about how we use technology to solve problems in our communities, we will just get like rural with more Zoom and leave a lot of potential transformation on the table. And I say this because I generally don't think of this as the Connectivity Authority's works. I think of this as like you all's work, like people in Maine communities who are doing the work of broadband deployment now. I hope that we are all successful beyond our wildest dreams and in bringing fiber and wireless connectivity to places that provide the telecommunications infrastructure that we want to have in these rural communities. But I think that there's an opportunity for you, the advocates who are doing this work right now, to think about the then what, to be like, how will my community look different once this process is complete? And that's something that like state funds can't really do for you. That's the conversations with each other. That's the work of entrepreneurs. That's the work of like individual problem solvers in the community to think hard about the then what. And so I'm hoping that while you think about the specific challenges of deployment, you are also thinking about those next steps, because we'll be ready and there to support you when you do. Thanks.
All right, thank you both so much. Just gonna throw myself up here as well. So thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate you kind of digging in, not just about the authority, Tim, but really broadband overall and the history of how we got here and the similarities and differences as well. We have a few questions that have come up in the chat, and again, feel free to throw a couple in there if you are just processing what you just heard and have a couple of questions that come up. If we can't answer them now, we'll try to answer them. And Peggy, I saw you answering a couple already, but I'm gonna start off with Peggy, because you talked a bit about Hampton. And so the question came up of, can they have a do-over? Opponents were calling it government-run internet. What should we be calling this endeavor if it's not that?
Well, the government wasn't going to run the internet. If you know, the internet is the thing that is the big piece, right? The government was going to own the infrastructure. So I think that the language that we use about, so there's a direct correlation here, or a direct metaphor between roads and railroads. Towns and public own the roads, right? And anybody can have access at any time at the same price to those roads. If you're the local delivery driver, you can have access at the same price that the UPS truck does. That's not true with railroads. Railroads are owned by a company, and you have to pay their fee to get on it. Sometimes you have to pay their fee to even cross it. And so that is what I think Hampton was trying to create with this broadband, is that they would own the infrastructure, but the actual delivery service would in fact be a private company. So this is a public-private partnership, right? And so that is the term that of art that everybody loves. There's a lot of different opportunities around public-private partnerships, but certainly a municipally owned network is one of those private partners. As to whether Hampton can do it again, that really is up to the city council, whether they decide they can put it back out and when they decide to do that. But there's really no reason that they couldn't. They were not seeking state funding to do this or federal funding to do this. They were going to do it with a revenue stream. And so that can happen if they want to do it again. But the messaging around the importance of the public-private partnership, that it isn't really a government takeover of the internet. So some of us have ideas about that. It is really about who owns the basic infrastructure, and that community was trying to own the basic infrastructure.
Thanks, Peggy. And so for this one, I actually might, well, either of you could answer, but maybe Tim from a, looking forward Maine Connectivity Authority position. So unserved, underserved, or understood, although the actual definitions of those we know are a bit more technical and at state of Maine level, at least potentially changing on underserved. But Bob kind of talks a little bit about poorly served. An incumbent cable provider is covering most of the community and can really charge, what they need to charge to sustain their profit model. Not particularly interested in upgrading to fiber across their current incumbent areas. And without any competition, more money will be pulled out of the pockets of Maine citizens. So is there a consideration that could be given to broadband funding for not just the unserved areas or those pockets of underserved, but really that in between where you might have some, what we say is adequate level of service, but you only have one provider, so you're stuck with whatever quality of service you have.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there, and I can maybe sort of take it in parts. So first, in terms of the Connectivity Authority, the Connectivity Authority's work, that the places where we are able to deploy funds will be dictated a lot by these specific standards that are set in the federal government's rules or the authorizing statute. So if you're looking for your un and underserved, it's like places with less than 120 will be a priority for some tranches of funding. Places without 25.3 will be the priority for others. And then the maps you use sort of differs between the different tranches of funding. One will use the FCC's updated broadband maps. Interestingly, the funding provided by the Treasury Department gives the Connectivity Authority a lot of flexibility to think about adequacy of service and whether not just like a provider's map of an area, but like the actual experience of people on the ground, including, I think, quite reasonably informed by the speed test, the crowdsourced speed testing work that the Broadband Coalition has done. So I think that's that provides the opportunity for places that like where a provider might be like, you have sufficient service, for people who live there to be like, not actually adequate here, and creates the potential for additional funding and support to overbuild or build in those places where there is existing service, but it's inadequate. The question of competition is really tough, right? Like, I think that particularly in rural areas, the economics don't support one provider. And so trying to create a framework that allows for at least facilities-based competition in a rural area is super hard, like running multiple fibers down roads where the economics barely support one. I think that we've seen in Maine, and I think there'll be more opportunities for competition sort of at the next layer up, where you have a common set of, you have an open access network where like it's owned by the town who allows multiple providers to operate over top of that network. There are existing models of that in Maine, like models that were sort of gained national attention for that. In Islesboro and Rockport, I think Sanford's network is open access, and so I just sort of off the top of my head. And so I think that that approach offers the opportunity for sort of competition among service providers in places where rural areas that wouldn't otherwise support it from a facilities perspective.
Thanks.
That was like too technical, but
no, that's okay. I think Peggy and Tim, you've both highlighted on funding, and so I actually have two questions. Is one, just can one of you repeat the funding that's coming in and available? It sounds like some people are trying to jot down notes of what you're saying, and again, we are recording. But
so first, I'm happy to recite the numbers, but we actually went through this funding in detail at the in a bunch of different places, but most recently the Maine Connectivity Authority's board meeting, and that's all those links to the video where we sort of walk through the funding and the specific requirements, most recently of the NTIA's or the Treasury Department Capital Projects Fund, is available on our website at www.maineconnectivity.org, which it's a rudimentary web presence right now, but we expect it to be upgraded in the near term.
I think Danielle just threw it in the chat too. So
thanks, Danielle. But I'm happy to run through it as well. And I think we expect the authority will be doing one in supplementary board meeting. We'll take a similar run through for both the board and for the public at large, kind of a detailed overview of the INVEST Act and the next tranche of federal infrastructure funds that's coming to the state. But big picture for Maine. So we have $21 million of American Rescue Plan funds that have been allocated by the legislature, 10 million this year, 11 million next year. And that's the 25.3, you can use it to expand broadband access. The next is 128 million from the Treasury's Capital Projects Fund. And that's the one that we described in the most recent, but again, it's for deployment of last mile broadband is the bulk of it. It's meant to be invested in infrastructure. And then there's a several stacks of fund, but the primary tranche is $100 million sort of base to every state, plus $4 for incremental funding beyond that as part of the INVEST Act, and additional funding for digital equity, sort of TBD. Those are the pools of funding. So if you're keeping a score at home, that's like $149 million or $249 million in funding that's the work we have in front of us.
Peggy, is there anything you wanted to add to that before I ask a little bit more specifically?
No, I mean, I think that the tricky part will be that all of those tranches of funding come from slightly different places and have slightly different requirements. So, they like to keep life interesting for us. And I also think that it's important. So the capital projects fund money is the unserved in that is, I think it's 100 over 20. They prefer that you build to 100, but you can build 120, 100 over 20. And there is flexibility in there around latency. It's not really that well defined. They just sort of said always on, always going. And so that's sort of hard to measure, but that fund and the American Rescue Plan fund both have deadlines on them. So the American Rescue Plan is it's the same money that towns and counties got. So that has to be essentially allocated by 2024 and spent by 2026. And the Capital Projects Fund, I think, is either 2026 or 2027. So those have specific timeframes that they have to be used by because they're part of the rescue plan. The Infrastructure Act does not have that kind of time frame on it. The state will have to put together probably, I think they're going to say, a 5-year plan to draw down that money. And again, we don't know exactly how much that's going to be because it will depend on the new FCC maps. So it's going to be like really important that we all pay attention to the FCC mapping process.
So what are your thoughts on integrated approach to building smart communities through affordable housing, energy efficiency, and broadband?
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Here's my always caution is that like we have the friction associated with integration and collaboration is real, and sometimes it can slow things down. So like getting the affordable housing piece and the energy efficiency piece and the broadband piece together requires coordination and working with the constraints of multiple funding streams and multiple funders often. And sometimes that friction slows things to a stop. And so the challenge in like getting something like that done is just making sure that you can move efficiently and effectively. That will not be, here, we just hang out at the board level here, but that'll be the work certainly of the early conversations we've had at the Connectivity Authority is like, how do we do the collaboration we know is important to make our work successful, but not have so much friction that comes with that collaboration that we just stop. And I think that'll be the challenge. I am super interested in how do we get connectivity inside multi-unit dwellings within Maine. I think there's a lot of places that show up as served because it hits the front door, but it doesn't extend within, and that leads to and the pricing and availability of connectivity within larger buildings, which Maine has less than many places, but more than some, is a thing that I think is we have a problem we haven't really looked at yet in Maine. And I think an important part of looking at adoption and accessibility everywhere will mean exploring just that. And certainly ensuring that new affordable housing is energy efficient and appropriately wired would be a great challenge for the authority to tackle.
And I will say that, in fact, was one of the reasons we thought about creating the authority. Last fall, when we did the CARES Act, which was we had some money left over from that first coronavirus relief that had to be used by the end of last year. We had looked at projects to bring better and lower cost service to some of the sort of inner city or lower income areas in Maine, and ConnectMaine couldn't do that because our statute doesn't allow us. And so I think that was a little bit of a germ that landed about why we needed an additional different approach so that we really could meet the needs of all Mainers.
And I would just flag that tomorrow we're having an inclusive innovation session, and we're going to hear from Post Road Foundation and Susan Crawford, who is also our keynote. And this comes in on some funding that's connecting smart grid technology and broadband. So if you want to dig into that a little bit deeper, I think that session might be for you. So I'm going to try to ask one more question before we wrap. And this one's around wireless internet solutions. So are there considerations for wireless internet solutions for areas, especially in Maine, where it will be difficult to pull and trench fiber end to end to every home? Thinking about those roads that are, way down on the coast or way, down a dirt road by the lake. As wireless technology coverage and speed continues to grow rapidly, this could be supplemental in the broadband build-out vision.
Yeah, I can take that one. I think one of my great fears in this process is that we might succeed in providing broadband to every, or we could succeed in providing fiber to every home business in Maine, and we would still create, we would still have a gap between the services in rural and urban communities, because in urban communities, you're going to have that level of speed and connectivity on a wireless platform. and there's a bunch of like technologies that are enabled by that where we haven't really thought about that. So just from like, I think I'm hoping that the authority will be giving some thought to how to use its investments to help expand access to mobile connectivity as well, which will be delivered wirelessly. And I think there's real opportunities there. I know there are, I think uniquely in Maine, there are providers who've really been committed to rural communities like US Cellular, who've been sort of thinking about this, and they may be potentially good partners for this. In terms of like what's actually providing the last mile connectivity, like I think there are technologies out there. I noticed Red Zone just deployed the Tirana platform it's using that provides like it's really impressive speeds over wireless now. So there are tools now that could deliver the speeds we typically associate with fiber wirelessly, and I think it would be silly for the Connectivity Authority to leave those off the table.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Peggy. So with that, that was our last question, but there were many more in the chat. So we're going to pull those and have Peggy and Tim just, back and forth online answer, and we're going to get those up on the Maine Broadband Coalition website. Peggy.
I will say one person asked the question about New Hampshire. Carol Monroe and Christina Hawkes will be here tomorrow morning. Not here, but here. And Carol actually lives in New Hampshire. She's the president of ValleyNet, but she lives in New Hampshire and knows about what's going on with many towns in New Hampshire. So that might be an opportunity to ask that question.
Perfect. So with that, I'm gonna we're gonna transition. So if you bear with us for just a few minutes, we're gonna transition into our next panel, which is around digital equity and inclusion. So thank you again, Tim and Peggy, and we hope you stay with us through the rest of the day.